Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 14th chapter in the book of Matthew. In the 13th chapter, he has an outburst of parables. There are 7 in them, and the parables are instructive illustrations which use relatable, familiar scenery and experience to communicate didactic truths. And the reason that he resorted to this method of teaching is because the opposition was mounted against them. The opposition were determined to trap him according to some doubtful utterance of reproach, according to which they could indict him as a violator of their own or Roman law. So the parables are designed to conceal the truth from insincere seekers, but it is known with those who have minds to know, hearts to feel, and eyes to see, and ears to hear. And there are 7 of them, the first of which is familiar, known as the parable of the seed, but I believe the more appropriate name is the parable of the soil. This is the first 23 verses. He gives it and then explains it. We're not going to cover any of the parables in detail. Then the wheat and the weeds from verses 24 through 30, and then he gives 3 in rapid 2 rather, the mustard seed and leaven, and then he explains the parable of the wheat and the weeds to the disciples in private company. And then there's 3 in rapid succession. These are like the 2 in between, the mustard seed and the leaven. They are so self-evident and simple as to require no extra explanation. And these are the parable of treasures hidden in a field, then the pearl of great price, the one who found it sold everything he had in order to obtain it, and then finally the dragnet of a fishing net. And these are all likened to, or beginning in the with the second one, the wheats and the wares, they all open with the kingdom of heaven is like this. And then we're going to review some of the material that takes place after the parables. And verse 53, and it came to be when Yahshua had ended these parables that he left there. And when he had come into his own country, he taught them in the synagogue, so that they were astonished and said, "Where did this one get this wisdom and miracles?" His own country would have been Nazareth, that was in Galilee. That was his own hometown. That was the place where he was not born but raised. He lived the first 30 years of his life in obscure anonymity as a carpenter, and he had done nothing remarkable in the first 30 years of his life. He was just an ordinary person. No one thought too much of him. And then he comes onto the scene. He's speaking wisdom and truth, the likes of which no one has ever heard. He's able to perform these miracles. And they want to know, where did he get it? Is this not the son of the carpenter? Is not his mother called Mary, and his brother Jacob, and Joseph, and Simon, and Judah? This is his immediate family. His mother was Mary. This was the virgin vessel through whom the power of the Most High overshadowed, and she conceived through the impartation of the Ruach Kadesh. And he had a stepfather, Joseph, who is no longer on the scene this time. He's only mentioned in his birth. Mary would outlive her son, who died at 33. But Mary and Joseph also sired biological children. We read the names of them here. Jacob is more familiar as James, the author of the epistle. Joseph, Simon, and Judah is the author of Jude. And he also had sisters, but they're not named because the ancients, they weren't too... females were not exalted to the same station of equality as males. And they stumbled at them, but Yahshua said to them, "A prophet is not unappreciated except in his own country and in his own house." So everywhere he went as this mystery man, this stranger, the crowds welcomed and applauded him and drew about him. But in his own hometown, the people he had grown up with, they did not appreciate it. And I believe this is somewhat to do with the provincialism. So in small towns, an expert is one who comes from over 200 miles away. And because they had known him and they thought they knew him, they just couldn't wrap their head around the fact that this was the long anointed and appointed Messiah. And he did not do many miracles there because of their unbelief. So faith is the key and the power which unlocks and unleashes the power of miracles. But when there's an absence of faith, he's not going to do it, not because he can't, but because he doesn't will it. Miracles are useless as shows of trickery or display if you are unbelief. And if you need a miracle to confirm your belief, then your faith is deficient. Now it's the 14th chapter. We're going to cover the first 12 verses. Here we read of the imprisonment and execution of John the Baptist, the Messiah's first cousin and his forerunner, the one who pointed the path and paved the way for him. We can read of his ministry in the 3rd chapter of Matthew, also 3rd in Luke. And we read an equivalent account of the 14th chapter in the 6th chapter of Mark. Mark gives his version of the same event, and that at that time Herod, the district ruler, heard the report about Yeshua. Herod was not Herod the Great, but Herod Antipas, one of the 4 sons to whom his province and jurisdiction was divided by the Romans upon Herod the Great's death in 4 BM. He died the same year that Yeshua was born. Little known fact, he was born 4 years before himself, before AD, so that error is attributed to the ignorance of a 6th century monk, a Scythian monk by the name of Dionysius. That's to whom we are indebted to for the marking of how we mark our calendars, according to which we divide it in years before Messiah, BM, and AD. And that's after him, but he was born 4 years, and Herod died in that year. So Herod Antipas was the one to whom Galilee, the native region to the north of Samaria, to the north of Judah, and Perea, that was his jurisdiction. And, everywhere he goes, there's this miracle man, the likes of which no one has ever seen. So sure enough, the report and the rumor reached his ears. And he said to his servants, "This is John the Baptist. He has risen from the dead, and that is why these mighty powers are at work with him." So John the Baptist, we read of his execution, but he's assumed already dead here in the this is repeated when the master asked his disciples, who do people say I am? Some say that you are John the Baptist, Matthew 16:14, and the resurrected. Now this man was doing something the likes of which, all the men of the kingdom, of all the men born of women, there was none greater than John the Baptist, as declared in the 11th chapter. We also read of his imprisonment in the 11th chapter of Matthew, and why he was there was because of his fearless denunciation of Herod Antipas's sexual sin. He married his brother's wife. We'll get into that more. For Herod had arrested John, bound him, and put him in prison because of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. Herodias was a granddaughter of Herod the Great. She married her uncle Herod Philip, who lived in Rome. While there as a visitor, Herod Antipas scooped her up and compelled her to divorce Philip and marry him. And Herod also divorced his own wife in order to attain the prized possession of his lust and affection. And Herodias was the And according to Leviticus 18:6, this was a big no-no. You were not allowed to marry your brother's wife while he still lived. That was forbidden, so it was illegal according to the Mosaic law. And John had said to him, "It is not right for you to have her." This was commensurate with the Levitical law, Leviticus 18:6, that was forbidden. And, of course, Herod Antipas struggled because he thought that John the Baptist had something to say. He might have been a prophet. So he imprisons him, but he reluctantly consents to his execution. The fact is accomplished through the trickery and the seduction of his own wife's daughter, who was, we'll read of her. And wanting to kill him, he feared the crowd because they held him as a prophet. So his reputation and esteem, he was the likes of the land of Israel had not seen the likes of a John the Baptist in over 460 years. The writing of Malachi is believed to be dated 432, and he would have began his ministry at the age of 30. So did the Messiah. This was consistent with Numbers 4:3. That was the age at which men were deemed old enough and experienced enough to minister, according to the Levitical law. And the crowds, the masses, they all knew he was a prophet. And Herod wanted, he was afraid to kill him because he feared the uproar and the revulsion and the revolt. So there was a politically precarious position in what he did. But as Herod's birthday was being held, the daughter of Herodias danced before him and pleased Herod. This woman is not named in the scripture, but from the writings of Josephus, the most reliable and authoritative secular historian of first century Judaism, identifies her as Salome. She was the daughter of Philip, and later she married a grand uncle Philip. So there was a lot of incest in the royal pedigree. If you think about it, you can follow the charts, you can line them all up. What I just said, they were engaged in incest, but the daughter of Herodias, Salome, would have been young and of marriageable age, in her sexual prime, her peak of beauty, and so she danced before him with lasciviousness and seductively, and that was to a designed intent. In effect, it was at the behest of her mother, in fact, she took it a lot more personally that John the Baptist denounced their sin. She wanted him dead and gone, but women did not have the power or authority. They had the influence as a wife of a ruler, but they did not have the authority. So he promised with an oath to give her whatever she asked. This is completely consistent with the character of Herod Antipas, this impulsive, irrational, extravagant generosity. He was so pleased and so enamored with his lust and the lust of his eyes that he promised her via an oath, that is a serious and binding thing, that she could have whatever she wanted. And in other other accounts, it's indicated that he would give her even up to half of the kingdom, but that's not what she wanted. And she, being urged on by her mother, said, "Give me here the head of John the Baptist on a dish." So she was the instrument of her mother, and she had the promise, and her mother knew it, and she consulted with her and said to make him execute John the Baptist, the threat to my reputation, the one who's going all up and down, consistently denouncing my sin, and evil people don't like the one who expose and denounce the evil, and they're often violent towards them. And the parading of heads of victims and enemies was not an uncommon practice in the ancient world. They would have carried them on dishes as a prize and trophy, and she wanted it on a dish, on a platter, his beheaded head. And the king was sad, but because of the oath and the guest, he commanded it to be given. So the king did not want to do it. He reluctantly consented, and he had no one to blame but himself for not governing his own lustful appetites. But he made it in the presence of all the guests. There was more than just him and Salome in the room. His oath was witnessed and testified and clearly heard by a room full of people. He would have been a palace court. There would have been plenty of people there. Royal palaces were not exclusively the resident of the royal couple. Palaces that big cannot house a single family, so they would have had attendants, servants, guests, people, visiting dignitaries. They weren't the only ones there. This was not a home that they were the exclusive ones living in. And sent and beheaded John in prison. John is in prison. He was there for his denunciation of the sin of Herod Antipas and his wife Herodias. And John was already in prison, and he would be beheaded. And beheading was, I guess I could be mistaken, but I was under the impression that the Jews could not implement capital punishment. At least that was the case in Yahshua. And Herod Antipas plays a role in the death of Yahshua. Pilate is reluctant to consent to his execution. He's resisting the clamors for his head, and so he passes him over to Herod Antipas, who asks for a miracle and is disappointed and sends him back. But they had the effect of reconciling Herod and Antipas there. In Luke's 23rd chapter, that it is written that they were made friends that day. There was prior tension between them because of the massacre that Pilate had unleashed amongst the Galileans that we read of in Luke 13:1. And his head was brought on a dish and given to the girl, and she brought it to her mother. The girl would have been Salome, the daughter. She brought it to her mother, the one who had compelled her to request this demand. And so she got her gift. She got what she wanted, and his head was on a platter in a dish, and she had her prized possession. She had what she asked for. She had what she wanted. And his disciple came and took away the body and buried it, and went and reported to Joshua. So John the Baptist had disciples. A disciple is one who lives with and learns from a master, and he had disciples. The Pharisees had disciples. Joshua had disciples. That term appears 263 times in the New Testament. The word Christian appears 3 times. A disciple is a follower and a mimicker and imitator and emulator of the master. And they took the body, the beheaded body, and they buried it with all the due deference and proper funerary rites, and they went and gave the news to Joshua. So there was a communication conduit between the disciples of John the Baptist and also Joshua. They're the ones who relayed his message to him in the 11th verse. When John was suffering from doubts whilst in prison, he said, "Are you the one we seek, or do we look for another?" And he told them, "Go tell them what you see. The poor are being fed, the blind are, the lame are walking, the blind are seeing," all these great things that are predicted in prophecy in Isaiah's 35th chapter, and I forget what the other one was. But in any case, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.